YB Khalsa, YB Khalsa. Welcome to everyone. This is the third now webinar that I'm hosting, asking the question, what will happen with Yogi Bhajan's Tantric Kundalini Yoga Sikh organization after these accounts of horrific abuse by Yogi Bhajan have surfaced. So I'd like to invite everyone to ask questions. There's a Q&A box down here, if you will, at the bottom of the screen where you can write your questions and I will try to answer them. And if I can't answer them, I will hopefully be able to direct you to someone who might be able to answer them. But I've had a lot of experience with the 3HO organizations. I was with Yogi Bhajan for some 30 years, as a lot of you may know, from about 1977 or so, 78, until he died in 2004. And in fact, I was there in Espanola where he died there at what they called the Dome. So I was further in 3HO for another about 6 years, 5 or 6 years, until I left the organization and started to criticize Yogi Bhajan. That was around 2009 to 2010 in those years. This was after I had read a really eye-opening book and experienced what true Sikhi was like when I was in India. This was around 2007, 2008. There's a book by a Dr. Gursant Singh called Sikhism and Tantric Yoga, which, like I said, was a real eye-opener for me. And it was highly critical of Yogi Bhajan and the way he appropriated the Sikh religion to promote and to make money off of the Sikh religion. This is what Yogi Bhajan did. He promoted the Tantric and Kundalini Yoga of his own making and used the Sikh religion and twisted it. He made up false narratives, lies, if you will, about how the Sikh gurus passed on this secret, ancient Kundalini Yoga and Tantric Yoga that Yogi Bhajan taught. So after I read this book, I knew that Yogi Bhajan was just really a fraud. So now, with the horrific accounts of Yogi Bhajan abusing people coming out, abusing his students, this has all come to the surface now and all been exposed, how Yogi Bhajan not only abused his students for power, money, and sex, abused his students financially, sexually, physically, emotionally, mentally. And this is, like I said, is all coming out now. There's really horrific accounts, even by some who were as young as 4 years old. It's really very disturbing and alarming. So in these webinars, I want to discuss, and I'd like input from anybody who would like to give their opinion in the form of a question, or just give me your opinion about what might happen to the organizations. Because I think we can all agree that things are going to change in the Yogi Bhajan organizations. There's just a proliferation of all this information and accounts about how Yogi Bhajan lied now and how he committed these frauds and these terrible abuses. So nobody's going to want to practice the teachings of somebody who is as toxic as Yogi Bhajan is. And so, like I said, I want to discuss what people think will happen. I have my own opinions. I think that the whole organizations, all of the organizations, the yoga organizations, the 3HO, and the Sikh organizations, at a minimum, there's going to be a complete change in leadership. And then the narratives that they put forth have to change as well. The teachings of Yogi Bhajan have to be completely dismantled, if you will, or completely discarded. There is no way, in my opinion, to keep the teachings separate from Yogi Bhajan. There's some very good articles out now and posts from longtime Yogi Bhajan followers who have given their opinions, if you will, and their ideas of why you just cannot keep the teachings of Yogi Bhajan. They're just basically filled with the toxicity, if you will, of Yogi Bhajan. Yogi Bhajan taught a whole lifestyle, and everything he did, all of his philosophy and his lifestyle was all intermingled with his teachings, his kriyas, if you will. I've gone over a lot of this in previous videos and in the last 2 webinars. I gave an analogy of how this Hari Jivan, who's the chief of protocol, would go and buy pepperoni pizzas, and he would just take the pepperoni off, and to maintain the flavor. And I think this is what some of these Yogi Bhajan people are trying to do. They're trying to just take the pepperoni off, which would be Yogi Bhajan, the toxic pepperoni off, and trying to keep the rest of the teachings of the pizza. You just can't do that. The whole thing is toxic, really. So let's look at some of these posts and narratives by people here. I have some screenshots that I took of some of those opinions. First, though, let's look at a new letter that just went out from the Sikh Dharma, KRI, 3HO organizations. And I want to talk a little bit about what they're saying here and how this might affect people. Now in this here, they say in this letter, I just got this letter day before yesterday, and it's saying that they want to start a conversation of how to listen to people in the community. And it says here, phase 1, how do we listen to everyone in our community? How do we need to engage? Healing process, how do we define our culture, and blah, blah, blah. And so they are inviting people to write to them and to find a way to start discussing some of these problems they're having. Well, I think this is a smokescreen. That's my personal opinion. I've written to them several times, and I even filled out their little participate form here. And I've never heard back from them in previous times that I've written about how Sikhs are really concerned, how there's a lot of un-Sikh-like activities happening there in the Yogi Bhajan organization, and how these teachings of Yogi Bhajan's are based on a big fraud of how he twists the Sikh religion, things like this. And this Philip Deslepi has shown that Yogi Bhajan made up a lot of his teachings, and that his Yogi Bhajan teachings are really dangerous, if you will, in the sense that I believe they're really for trying to induct people into this cult. They're really trying to get people into a trance-like state. Anyway, I've talked about all this in other videos, but the people have never, these Yogi Bhajan followers who are the leaders in these groups have never responded. So I think that this is really a, like I say, just kind of a smokescreen to get people to think that they're doing something. That's my personal opinion. And I took a screenshot here of a poll that is on the internet now. Don't remove Yogi Bhajan's name from the teachings. And you can see here that about 3,234 people have signed this petition. Now, I think this is a pretty stable number. I've been watching this poll for about 3 or 4 weeks now. And in the last week or so, it hasn't changed much. So I think this is a pretty good indication of just how many, what I would call hardcore Yogi Bhajan followers there are out there in the world. Because I think this petition has reached about everybody in the Yogi Bhajan group. So 3,234 people have signed this. And it gives you an idea of how many of these hardcore followers there are out there. And that's not a, insignificant number. It's not huge compared to the rest of the yoga community and the Sikh community. But these people are in control of the organization. And from what I've seen and their responses, or lack of responses, we'll say, it doesn't appear that they're really going to make any changes unless there's a lot of other pressure put on them. So my proposal is to actually stage protests against their organizations and force them by boycotting the yoga classes, by boycotting any support for their Sikh organizations like SikhNet and their Sikh Dharma International. Don't give them any donations. And when their funds dry up and they see protests in front of their ashrams and their headquarters, I believe that they will be forced to resign, these people who are in charge of the organizations. But I don't think that just by doing these chat rooms and webinars with them and giving stories that it's really going to make any significant changes. Here's an organizational chart that shows all of these Yogi Bhajan, some of them, organizations. And this is profits and non-profits. Now, one judge in one of their lawsuits that was ongoing described all of these organizations as a Russian nesting doll. It's so complicated and so vast that it really is just a real mess of different organizations. And you can see here another chart of all of those. It's controlled ultimately by the Sri Singh Saab Corporation. And ironically, it's still named the Sri Saab Corporation, which is one of these fake titles Yogi Bhajan gave himself. And so this is their headquarters down there in Espanola, New Mexico. And I did this crude screenshot on Google Earth. And I wrote in here some of these places. SikhNet, for example, is here. And 3HO, Sikh Dharma International, is right nearby there too. The Akal Security, which is a for-profit, one of the largest security companies in the world, 15,000 employees, is located there. This Kundalini Research Institute is over here. This KIT is another for-profit organization. And then the Yogi Bhajan Ranch is this big piece of property here. It's about 30 acres. And then there's some Akal offices back over here too. So this is the main headquarters here. And my thought is to stage some protests down there. And in fact, what would be really great is to protest until they actually make some of these changes. Now you can see more of these organizations outlined in a mapping here, all controlled by the Citizen Sub Corporation, which is a 10-member board, and they just had an election, by the way. And this is a map too of that area you can see here. And I own some land too, by the way, here. That's why I put this 1-acre parcel, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. Okay, so again, this is that petition. You can see here 3,000 or so signatures. So this is the road, East Sombrio Road, which is right in front of this headquarters. It runs down here, and you can see all the cars parked here. This is a Call's parking lot, and they have, like I said, about 15,000 employees. Not, of course, not all of them there, but their employees are spread all over the world, actually. So staging some protests here right in front of their headquarters, marching up and down with placards that read maybe something like Yogi Bhajan was a fraud, getting press out there. I'm sure that television stations, especially in Albuquerque, would come up and cover this. So that's my proposal, and have it an ongoing protest that would go on for many months, whatever it took. And you can see here, this is the ACAL headquarters sign there. And then, like I said, I have some acreage here, 2 commercial 1-acre pieces. And this would be a good place too to maybe stage some protests, or actually to build something where we could have a museum, some kind of center, a cult awareness center, Yogi Bhajan Cult Awareness Center, something like that. And you can see this here is one of the pieces, and then another piece here coming down Highway 106 from Santa Fe. You would turn right here on this Sombrio Road East, and then the ashram slash 3HO center headquarters is just down here, the street. So these properties that I own are ideally located where there'd be something could be set up to stage protests, or have some kind of permanent structure where there could be like cult awareness, and people could stop and get information about it. Here's another county assessor's map that shows one of the pieces there, which is really ideally located. You can't enter the 3HO headquarters without going by this property that I own here. It's along there. Here's some I guess some preliminary plans that I did of some ideas that I had about a museum, and have some nivasas there, housing for people who would come visit. Another idea. So again, you can see this map I put here. Okay, let's go back out and look, see if there's some questions. Don't see any questions yet, so we'll go back to the pictures and show you some other thoughts that I have about why you cannot separate Yogi Bhajan's teachings from Yogi Bhajan. Now, also, I want to encourage people to raise their hand digitally. There should be a little hand down there, looking like a hand, that's a raised hand down at the bottom of your screen. If you want to ask a question, I can unmute you, and then you can ask a verbal question. So just look for that little hand down there at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to ask a verbal question. So let's go back out and look at some of the other pictures here. All right, so this was a comment that took a screenshot of somebody by the name of Ornella Amor. And I kind of talked about this in the last webinar, where she says that Kundalini is great technology independently of Yogi Bhajan. And she says, I say, keep the message and forget about the messenger. A lot of people liked this. You can see 44 people. That was the most liked comment on the webinar, the first webinar that I did. So I want to address that again. I had some further thoughts on that from last week. There was a great post by this Tej Steiner. He was a leader in the Yogi Bhajan group back in the 70s and early 80s. He was the head of the Toronto ashram, I believe. And he tells a little bit about his history here in this Premka White Bird and Golden Cage group. And he asked the question, is it possible to separate Yogi Bhajan from the Kundalini Yoga teachings? That's right down here at the bottom. And then by extension, is it possible to separate Yogi Bhajan from the organizations he created to pass on his teachings? So basically his conclusion is saying that no, you can't separate them. He says a clear answer came to him, and he says, of course it's not possible to separate them. They are one and the same. And that's my conclusion as well. You cannot separate them. Everything is just tied together with Yogi Bhajan taught. Yogi Bhajan was a control freak. And he did everything, I believe, now looking back at it, to make people like him. And everything he gave out was oriented towards making people more like him. We even tried to emulate the way he talked, the way he breathed, everything that he did. And it's just a cult. So to answer this question, can you separate the teachings from the teacher? It's just not possible. He says further here, he says, talks about how many people say you can separate them, and even though he's a scoundrel and everything, how you can separate the teachings. This Mr. Steiner says, this is a myth that he created to cover his corruption. It's a clever myth. Why is it a myth? Here are a few of the pieces of the puzzle that fell into place for me Saturday night. He says, Kundalini Yoga, as taught by Yogi Bhajan, is entirely based on overstimulating the sympathetic nervous system. And I think that's really true. All of this breath of fire that Yogi Bhajan gave out, all these really difficult yoga poses where you were straining yourself, and these gong meditations, they were just really very abrasive, if you will. I don't know how else to describe it. Mr. Steiner says here, all of that breath of fire, all of those yoga poses held for some time, hours at a time, he's yelled admonishments. Keep up and keep up. Don't give an inch. And fake it until you make it. All of that masculine supercharged push that came with every class he taught and every tantric line he facilitated. Okay, so this, I agree with this. I think that Yogi Bhajan smashed all these things together to get people into a trance-like state, and to get people where they were more susceptible to be inducted into his cult. All designed this way. They're all designed to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, overstimulate it. He was getting us high. And I talked about this many, many years ago. I think Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini Yoga was a way Yogi Bhajan would get people high. And what I mean by high is a fake kind of feeling of like well-being. And if people just want to have a feeling of well-being, my thought is you can get it by other kind of exercise. You don't have to do Yogi Bhajan's kriyas and all of these very overstimulating sympathetic nervous system exercise, kriyas or whatever. So he talks more about how Yogi Bhajan's practices were not from the heart. And you can read these here, just stop the video when I put it on YouTube, and then you can read this whole thing. And he says here, to come into our hearts requires masculine outward thrust, but it obviously also requires feminine inner receptivity. Compassion, kindness, caring, it requires embodiment rather than transcendence. It asks us to self-regulate our nervous system rather than overstimulate it. So here's a really good reasoning about why Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini Yoga is dangerous. And many people tell me, oh, it works, so let's just forget about Yogi Bhajan and his abuses. But I find that the yoga works. Well, people who take illicit drugs think that works for them. And they're not looking at the long-term effects. So I think this post really shows how the long-term effects of Kundalini Yoga are dangerous, overstimulating the sympathetic nervous system. That's the bottom line. He says also here, I thought this was really good. He says, do you ever wonder why love was not ground zero and foundation for everything that Yogi Bhajan taught? This is because love wasn't foundational for him. He couldn't receive all the love that we freely gave him. We had no peers, no real friends, no community other than the one he controlled. As I mentioned, Yogi Bhajan was a control freak. Then he says, today I still don't sense that love is central Kundalini Yoga teachers training. It's mostly inhale, exhale, hold your breath kinds of directing. I've gotten this feedback from other people who practiced the Kundalini Yoga as well. Many of the first generation Kundalini Yoga teachers that I know taught through their persona of being teachers. They were often caught in role playing, something scripted. Many of them took on the mannerisms and even the accent of Yogi Bhajan. That's what I was saying. Many taught through mimicry rather than their own personal embodiment of the yoga, etc., etc. Most of Yogi Bhajan's top lieutenants were not honorable men. They were not kind. They lied. Several were criminals. They believed that the end justifies the means and lived into the mean belief. Harijivan Singh in LA, who I knew very well, actually did business with him. Guru Jot Singh in DC, didn't know him very well. Others in between, it had a mafia smell to it. I can really attest to this. And this all goes along with Yogi Bhajan's lifestyle. So when people say that you can separate the yoga from Yogi Bhajan, or what Yogi Bhajan taught from Yogi Bhajan, I think it's just really impossible. Yogi Bhajan had a long history of misogyny. He violently raped several of his young students. He was publicly abusive to his wife. Women were his servants. He called them prostitutes and whores when they left. Guru Fateh Singh in Toronto still proclaims today that Premka is lying and that she wrote her book to make money. Harijivan Singh uses his official organizational title to slander Premka as well. No one in 3HO or Sikh Dharma has demanded that they stop. Yeah, that's really true. I knew Harijivan very well, and he was charged in a field of schemes. It's a fraud that he did, where he was selling these gemstones to elderly people and telling, evidently, according to the Federal Cray Commission, him and his boiler room employees were telling people that they could, that they would buy these gems back and as an investment and everything, and turned out to be just a complete fraud. So I agree with what Mr. Steiner is telling in this. And like I said, I think this is a very good post explaining everything. says the current leadership knew everything that Premka writes about in her book. They could have written their own books, yet they were also, there was only cover up and denial until her book made their denial look a little silly. Yogi Bhajan created an organizational structure that was sexually repressed, shaming, male dominated, pleasure avoidant, homophobic, and gender constricted in some ways. It is not non-inclusive as the Catholic Church. He set the tone of all of this. Much of it continues today. Did you ever wonder where the enlightened ones were in 3HO, the ones who spent 40 to 50 years practicing Yogi Bhajan teachings and became masters themselves? I think it's a very good point. Why aren't these people who practiced Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini Yoga enlightened? Yogi Bhajan said that you'd been enlightened in 40 days if you practice his Kundalini Yoga. But evidently they weren't doing it perfectly or something along those lines, because I have not seen anybody who's enlightened, and they're not even aware, or they would have been aware of Yogi Bhajan's frauds and his abuses. It says here, from my perspective, when spiritual teachings are as prescriptive as his Kundalini Yoga teachings, in which students are given an endless list of things to do to become enlightened, those students will just end up still list of things to do to become enlightened. Those students will just end up still not finding what they're looking for. Kundalini Yoga today continues to be almost 100% prescriptive. It's a yoga of endless doing, where light is available in high bursts but cannot be sustained in daily life. Yeah, Yogi Bhajan was giving thousands of mantras to do. It was impossible to do them all. And so you found yourself doing these prescriptive mantras and kriyas, and it was all man-made. There was no idea of grace. And this was one of the big problems, or issues, I guess I should say, that I had with Yogi Bhajan's teachings after I read Dr. Shaloshan Singh's book. That from the Sikh perspective, we believe as Sikhs that we do devotional service. We do devotional recitation of Gurbani, and it's out of love for Waheguru that, and then Waheguru, by Waheguru's grace, by God's grace, then God gives us whatever. And it's not like we're trying to do these prescriptive kriyas or man-made mantras. We're doing 108 times for several times a day or whatever, like Yogi Bhajan was prescribing. That we try to get these. We don't try to get these things like, you know, wealth or health or power. But Yogi Bhajan would give all of these different prescriptive yogas and kriyas so that you could attain those things. So I really had an issue with that, especially after I read Dr. Shaloshan Singh's book, The Sikhism and Tantric Yoga, and I recommend you all read it. It's only by Waheguru's grace that we're given anything. And one is to be humble if one is to receive this grace. That's the idea. But Yogi Bhajan's teachings were overstimulating, trying to attain these things by your own works, by your own efforts, if you will. So this is something, like I said, I would recommend you read. You can go through this video here and read this post by this Tej Steiner. Okay, so let's see. Doesn't appear that there's still any questions. I'm just checking here to see. Okay. I really hope that this Q&A is switched on. Let me just check to make sure it is. Yeah, it says I'm allowing anonymous questions, and so it should be on. So I hope people will ask some questions. All right, well, let's go back to some of these pictures. I wanted to just talk a little bit about some new information I learned this week. When I was trying to get in the US Army in 1982, there was a large campaign to get me into the US Army that was funded by 3HO. And of course, Yogi Bhajan knew all about it. And Pamela, she was the head of it, this Premka, as her name was back there in 1982. I was actually approached by Krishna Kar, who is the head there of the 3HO organization, to join the US Army in 1982 as a Sikh and not cutting my hair or beard. So there was a publicist hired, a professional, who did the publicity, and he was very good. Evidently, he had coached and trained people who appeared on 60 Minutes and did a lot of publicity for several other campaigns at that time. I don't remember exactly what they were, but he was quite good and quite knowledgeable. So this campaign for me to be able to join the US Army took place over several weeks. And I was interviewed by CNN and other news networks. So all of a sudden, this campaign ended. Yogi Bhajan pulled the plug on the funding for it. And I was really very disappointed, because I really wanted to be able to join the US Army as a Sikh and to represent Sikhs there in the US Army. And so I never knew what really happened, why this funding was pulled by Yogi Bhajan. Evidently, Pamela talks about it in her affidavit when she sued Yogi Bhajan in 1986, or 87, I'm sorry. And so she says that Yogi Bhajan just all of a sudden, it was always saying that this guy was too expensive, etc., and that this campaign was not worth it. In other words, it wasn't worth the money. And we were making great headway in getting a lot of publicity and getting a lot of, how do you call it, support from the public on this issue. And it was going to the federal courts so that we could fight it there. So anyway, I talked to someone who actually had a good relationship with Yogi Bhajan back in those years, in the early 80s. And this person is of Punjabi descent. And he told me that the reason this funding was pulled was because there was a lot of pressure from Washington. Ronald Reagan was in office then, he was the president then, and there was a strong pressure by the moral majority, they called them, Christian right groups, that didn't want to see Sikhs be able to join in the US Army anymore. So our campaign was getting a lot of publicity, and putting a lot of pressure on Washington, is the way this person that I talked to describes it. And Yogi Bhajan got wind of this. In fact, according to this person, Yogi Bhajan was called personally by the powers to be in Washington. I don't know who exactly that was, but certainly some very powerful people in Washington, and was told that if this campaign did not stop, that they were going to investigate Yogi Bhajan for all of his illegal activities, drug smuggling, and these fraudulent boiler rooms, and all of these fraudulent businesses that Yogi Bhajan was involved in. Not only that, Yogi Bhajan had an arrest record in India, and he had problems there too, from what I understand, where somebody else had told me that he was under investigation by the Indian government when he left there for a smuggling ring, because Yogi Bhajan was a customs officer. So Yogi Bhajan had all of these skeletons in his closet. And as you probably all know, this Guru Jot Singh was arrested for one of the biggest smuggling of marijuana in the history of the United States. And this Guru Jot Singh was one of his right-hand men. And this Hari Jivan here that I'm sitting next to in 1982, ironically, he's the one who ran the boiler toner room there, which was a fraudulent business there in Los Angeles. So there were all of these fraudulent businesses. And so the people, the powers to be in Washington evidently threatened Yogi Bhajan and told him that if this campaign didn't stop to allow me to join the US Army without cutting my beard and dastar and taking off my dastar and turban, that Yogi Bhajan would be investigated by the FBI or whatever. So Yogi Bhajan pulled the plug on the funding. So that's what was told to me just this last week, and I wanted to pass that information on. I think it's important for the history here, so we get all the facts straight about what really happened in this campaign, because it was a big deal. Up to this point, Sikhs have been allowed an exemption as far back as the Truman administration to be able to enlist in the US Army or the armed services and still wear their turbans and uncut beard. So Ronald Reagan did away with that exemption because of this pressure from the moral majority. And so when I tried to join, it was a very big deal. Anyway, so that's the new information I have. Let's look at some of these questions now. It appears we've got a question. Okay, so question here. Have any idea what is happening to all the money that was left in YB's estate? Who controls it? What it's used for? And who is still fighting over it? Any idea how much money is currently left and what businesses are currently operating? Is the school in India still operating? All right, well, these are very good questions. Or very good questions, yeah, I guess they're questions. Okay, first, they always say, you know, follow the money. So I'm not 100% sure what's happening with all the money. Of course, there is a lot of money involved. I know that these lawsuits have been going on for a long time between Yogi Bhajan's widow and family and the current leadership there in the Yogi Bhajan organization. I'm not sure at what stage these lawsuits are at. I'm not an attorney and I haven't really followed them that closely. I do know they're still fighting over it. And they're fighting over this jewelry that Yogi Bhajan owned as well. and there's just millions of dollars worth of jewelry. I've told about stories how we used to go to Jerry's jewelry shop up there on Beverly Drive almost every day. I was on security during the 80s in Los Angeles. And Yogi Bhajan would always buy these really expensive gems and jewelry and trade and buy and sell. I also would accompany the Shakti Parwakar, who was one of Yogi Bhajan's secretaries, to the bank, where Yogi Bhajan had many, many safe deposit boxes full of jewelry. And Yogi Bhajan would get a set of jewelry for the week, and he would wear different jewelry every day, depending on the way the stars and the planets were aligned for that day. I would accompany Shakti Parwakar up to the bank to get this jewelry. And when I saw the jewelry, you know, we'd go in one of those little rooms where the jewelry was, where we could open the safe deposit box and could look and examine the jewelry and pick out what we wanted or what she wanted to take back. The eyes just popped out of my head. There was so much jewelry there, just amazing. Okay, so getting back to our question, well, there's a lot of businesses that are still operating, of course. Call Security is the main one, and Yogi Tea. Those are the main businesses that are still operating and still making a lot of money. And as many of you heard about Call Security, they've been involved in some very shady and unethical business practices, in my opinion. You may have heard how Call Security guards these prisons where they keep immigrants. And it's been revealed that Call Security made millions off of a scheme where they would only give $1 a day to these immigrants who are not charged with any crimes or anything, but they will only pay them $1 a day while they're waiting in these prisons and waiting for a hearing in these prisons. They will only pay them $1 a day to do all of these menial tasks, sweeping, kitchen duty, and all these things. And then a Call Security, would collect the normal market rate from the government. So in effect, they would make millions of dollars off of this slave labor that like I said, they were only giving these immigrants $1 a day and collecting the normal market rate. It's just really despicable how they could do that and call themselves a spiritual organization or based or owned by a spiritual organization. So that went on for many, many years. They were deporting and making money off of the deportation of immigrants for 20 years or so. Really despicable. Now, as far as the school in India, it is still operating, although they've closed it now. The excuse they've given is because of this COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic. But I've heard from other sources that they closed it because of all these scandals now and these surfacing of the abuses that Yogi Bhajan did. Because how could you have parents sending their children to a school where the head founder of the school has been found to have been abusing children, both sexually and physically? It's just not going to work. So I think there's another question here. No, it doesn't look like there's another question. Okay, so let's go back to some of these other pictures. Okay, so I'll show you some pictures of more pictures of the land down there in Espanola and their headquarters. I think this is important so that people see just some of the specific things that need to change down there. So of course, this is the main headquarters there. And this is something I'd like to work on. My wife and I are planning to move down there in a few weeks. We have a house down there. And I plan to be petitioning the New Mexico government to rename this Highway 106, or take the name off this Yogi Bhajan Memorial Highway. We'll make a petition there and work to get this Yogi Bhajan Memorial Highway removed, the signs and the commemoration of this highway to Yogi Bhajan. I'm sure the state of New Mexico and the people of New Mexico don't want a highway named after a sexual abuser like Yogi Bhajan and somebody who was just a complete fraud. You can see how people have taken their pictures by it, you know, and it's just something that needs to change. So that's something I'm going to be working on changing. I'm going to be working on opening up the Gurdwara so that people can visit there without having these fences and gates keeping them from visiting the Sri Guru Granth Sahib, the Sikh scriptures, and the receiving darshan from Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. So that's something that needs to change. These murtis need to be removed. You can see SikhNet's headquarters is right there. All these gates need to be open so that the Gurdwara is accessible to people. It needs to be accessible for people. They call the Gurdwara a mandir, which is really a Hindu monastery or temple. And this all has to change. All these things have to change. They keep these idols or murtis of Baba Sri Chand there. These are all things that need to change. And I'm going to be working with people. I'd like others to come there to New Mexico so that we can work on these issues, discussing them, protest out in front of the Gurdwara, in front of their ashram there. You can see how people put offerings to this Sri Chand Murti, which is against Sikh teachings, by the way. I mean, I realize that Hindus do this, and that's fine. But the people there say they're Sikhs, and they're misrepresenting the Sikh faith. That's the big issue I have with many of these anti-Sikh practices that 3HO carries out. You can see how they worship here, these murtis. That's that Baba Sri Chand Murti that is in that wooden pagoda that's just outside of there. These paintings and tantric photos of Yogi Bhajan inside the Gurdwara need to come down. They need to come down everywhere there. And I'm going to be working towards getting all those things removed. These Chotakam medication photos need to be removed from the Gurdwara, and these practices of meditating on Yogi Bhajan's picture, that all needs to change. So these are all things that I want to work diligently on changing there, and protesting, making the press aware, making the public aware of these un-Sikh-like and cult-like practices that are being carried out there. Now, this is something I've talked about before, but it's so important and such a egregious violation of the Sikh Maryada, the Sikh Code of Conduct, that I want to point out again. This Khalsa Council that Yogi Bhajan set up, which is quite presumptuous because all of the people on this so-called Khalsa Council are Yogi Bhajan followers. And you won't find anybody traditional Sikhs from the Punjab who are on this Khalsa Council. Anyway, so when they closed their meetings in 2014, this was the 10th anniversary of Yogi Bhajan's death. They closed the meetings with it. They stay here in this highlights. We did the Tritaka meditation together. Members shared how their serious thought touched their lives. So the Tritaka meditation is this meditation where they meditate on Yogi Bhajan's photo, that one there that I showed you earlier, this one right here. And so they did this instead of doing an ardas or a Sikh prayer in ending their meetings. It's just really beyond the pale. This is the Jethadar of the Akal Takht. I think he had left by this point, just to be fair, before they did this Tritaka meditation. So these are all things that we want to see change there. You can see here people doing yoga inside the Gurdwara and in the presence of Siddhi Guru Granth Sahib Ji and in the Darbar of Siddhi Guru Granth Sahib Ji. This is something that needs a change and needs to stop, is this Aquarian Sadhna, which involves Yogi Bhajan mantras and one Hindu mantra that he gave out to do during this early morning Amrit Vela, which should be reserved for doing the 5 banis, which Sikhs recite. This is if you're a Sikh. And many of these people consider themselves to be Sikhs. And this is inside the Sikh Gurdwara too. So this should not be done there. More of the yoga inside there. You can see there this Yogi Bhajan Tritaka meditation or Guru Yoga photo here on the wall there. And this mural here has got to go. All these things have got to go. There's a lot to be done there, really. And it's not going to happen real quickly, I don't think, but through protesting, through boycotting, I think they just will not have any other choice. Their organizations will, and any kind of yoga will just become so toxic, Yogi Bhajan yoga, that they'll just be left marginalized and in a position where they'll have no other choice but to change the leadership and to drop all of these ridiculous and dangerous yoga asanas and kriyas and all this. So these are some paintings that, I guess you'd call them that, drawings or paintings that Yogi Bhajan did and gave to me back in the 80s. And it shows, to me, how Yogi Bhajan was really into this tantric or sexually oriented practices, if you will. He would have me go buy these sea cucumbers, they were called, and at the Chinese market down there in LA. And the Chinese believe these sea cucumbers have aphrodisiac qualities. And I don't believe it now anyway, but Yogi Bhajan obviously did, because he would have me go down there many times and he would eat these, evidently. It's really disgusting to acquire these aphrodisiac qualities, I assume. And my question is, somebody who claims themselves to be a celibate, why is he going there and having me buy these sea cucumbers and eating them? Now you can see here this is a book that was published in the 1990s, I believe, yeah, 1990s, called The Game of Love. And they should have called it The Game of Lust, really, I think. Drawings by YB, and then he put some poetry in there. This is one of YB's drawings. It wasn't actually in the book, but I think it really is indicative of Yogi Bhajan's attitude or character. He's written this word power here next to this phallic, obviously phallic drawing. And then he's got a woman here. You can tell she's got a skirt on here in the middle of this phallic drawing, and then the words love up here. What a really demented mind Yogi Bhajan must have had. I just can't imagine. Well, it's embarrassing now that I think about how we all followed him for so long. And again, this is that book, and this is some wild. I have this painting actually, it's really sad to see how people were following this, and I would continue to follow Yogi Bhajan's demented thinking. He's got another phallic drawing here with the word God written down here. This was in 1987. This is just about the time that the lawsuits were going on where Premka, or Pamela now, and Kate Felt sued Yogi Bhajan, for all kinds of abuses. And Yogi Bhajan just, he refused to go to the depositions. I know that he could have, and I've talked about this in earlier webinars and videos, how Yogi Bhajan just absolutely refused to go to his deposition, which he was subpoenaed for and ordered by the court 5 different times. I got that right from the attorney's mouth, if you will. And then later I found a video where this Peter Gregorios, who's the attorney for Yogi Bhajan, says that he tried to subpoena Yogi Bhajan 5 different times during that year, 1987. And Yogi Bhajan would always get these doctors' excuses from his 3HO doctors, his Yogi Bhajan disciple doctors. And I know that Yogi Bhajan could have gone to these depositions, because every day during that period I was on security, and Yogi Bhajan would go to La Scala. We would go to La Scala and these fancy restaurants, and then go shopping in Beverly Hills, and maybe even take in a movie afterwards. So he was definitely capable of going to these depositions. These are more un-Sikh-like practices there that need to stop. All this dancing and carrying on there. The Siddhi Guru Granth Sahib, the Sikh scriptures, are here in this room. And this is just a literally thin garage door, plastic garage door. And all of these dancing and wild things are going on outside and really interrupting the akampat, the reading, continuous reading of the Sikh scriptures. And when I brought this up, 5 years ago with the Yogi Bhajan people, they didn't do anything. There was really a lot of outrage from the traditional Sikh community about this, but they've never changed anything. The only way they're really going to change is by boycotting them and getting to the money. I think it really gets to that question that was brought up earlier in this webinar about the money issue. If we cut off their money, then I think you can cut out these practices, and they'll change. So you can see here how they're dancing wildly, and then they have the Sikh scriptures there, and they're doing what's called an akampat, continuous reading. And I would read from the akampat then, and I couldn't hear even myself speak or recite the Gurbani. It was just really bad. I remember this back then. They ask for a donation. It's pretty much a required donation to get a spiritual name, and they just hand out names, Sikh names like Singh and Kaur, like candy. It's just really appalling. This is what the 3HO does, and it says, please make a contribution of at least $40 per name. This is going on right now, and I have people that I know on the inside that have told me they make thousands of dollars a month off of this. It's something that just has to stop. Sikh name is traditionally acquired when you read from the Siddhi Guru Granth Sahib Ji, and you get a hukam, and you take the first letter of that beginning part of the Shabad, and then you choose a name from that. And then when you use Singh and Kar, you're supposed to understand what that's about and what that means to use Singh and Kar in your name. Many of these Yogi Bhajan people, they don't know what that means. I know for a fact, I didn't even hear about the Sikh Code of Conduct or Sikh Maryada when I was in 3HO. So it was all about Yogi Bhajan's teachings and all of these occult practices that Yogi Bhajan promoted and basically sold. So they're selling these spiritual name destiny cards here, $20, these things. Everything's about money with them. You can see here they use astrology, which is a violation of the Sikh Maryada as well, and not using the Sikh teachings. You ask for their date of birth here, etc., etc. This is a astrological concept, the Aquarian age, and they're using that, which has to stop as well. So this is Yogi Bhajan's ranch here in the front of it, and this is it here. There are many statues there, and murtis as they're called, which are like idols that people worship. And again, I realize that worshiping murtis is part of the Hindu tradition, but not part of the Sikh tradition. So if these people want to continue these practices of Yogi Bhajans and these occult practices, then they shouldn't call themselves Sikhs. I have no problem if they just go off and do it themselves and not use Sikh dress or Sikh names and call themselves Sikhs, or and collect donations from Sikhs too. And you can see here, this is a big murti or statue of Ganesha, which is a Hindu deity, in front of Yogi Bhajan's ranch, in front of the gate there of the ranch. And you can see here a close-up of it here, and clearly see the golden statue. Why would any person who considers themselves a leader in the Sikh community be putting a huge murti of a Hindu god? Because Sikhs believe in worshiping one god and not something that has form like this. And you can see Yogi Bhajan's fake title here, the Sri Singh Sahib title here. So this was clearly his. And all this worship of Yogi Bhajan has got to stop. You can see here how they've made this big murti of Yogi Bhajan made of bronze, and they're worshiping at Yogi Bhajan's death place there in Espanola. There's a lot there that needs to change. I'll be working towards changing those things, bringing Sikhs there to help with these changes, protesting, making petitions, boycotting and campaigning so that people boycott these Kundalini yoga classes, boycotting SikhNet and these other Yogi Bhajan organizations. Now, I'll mention also that Guru Gobind Singh Ji, the 10th Sikh Guru, told us not to worship at the graves of the dead. This is exactly where Yogi Bhajan died in 2004. This is what they call the Dome, and they worship there. Here is this ivory, some of the ivory that Yogi Bhajan collected in the fur coats. He lived a luxurious lifestyle of conspicuous consumption and had no feeling or compassion for animals. All these ivory statues and figurines, they need to be destroyed. I think what they should do is just have like an ivory crush day or a ivory burning day. This would show solidarity with the animal rights groups and just destroy this whole image or concept that this conspicuous conception of Yogi Bhajan was something to be revered or to be archived. All of this has to change. I would suggest these are all at the ranch, and they just burn all these robes and all of these things in a big bonfire and show solidarity with the ordinary people and with animal rights groups, I think this would go a long way to getting rid of this image of Yogi Bhajan being some elitist person who lives a luxurious lifestyle and was above people. I think it would do a long ways. I actually was told by Yogi Bhajan to buy him some ivory just before it became illegal. This was at a gem show in it was in the mid 1980s, I believe. Maybe towards the end of 1980s. I remember it was a gem show, and Yogi Bhajan told me to buy this ivory gems ivory chess set for him. I spent $1,200 on it. I remember putting it on my American Express card. It was money I didn't really have. Anyway, this shows you how Yogi Bhajan demanded things from people, and I'm really kind of ashamed to say it now, but I went along with it for so long. Towards the 1990s, I realized the Yogi Bhajan was not all that he said he was, and started to argue with him and put up a fight. Well, let's stop this right now. And I notice there's another question here. It says here, what about the Aquarian Sadhna? It's part of Sikh tradition or practices instead of Nitnem, for example. And that's a really good question. I did talk about it earlier, but maybe this person didn't hear that. So let me go back to this screen and show you. I've got a couple pictures of the Aquarian Sadhna here that they're doing. All right, here we go. Hope you can all see that. So this is actually a picture taken from the Hacienda de Guru Ram Das website. And they are actually advertising for people to come to New Mexico and experience this Seva Sadhna, they call it, a 3HO yogic lifestyle immersion program in Espanola, New Mexico. Now, this Aquarian Sadhna was something that Yogi Bhajan told all of his students to do, whether they were Sikhs, whether they were yoga students, or whatever. And it was something that was prescribed and something that everybody had to do every single morning. And so you can see all of these attendees, if you will, Sikh and non-Sikh, practicing this Aquarian Sadhna at the early ambrosial mornings hours. It starts at about 3:45, and it's done in Espanola inside the Darbar of Sri Guru Granth Sahib, inside the Gurdwara. Now, what the Aquarian Sadhana consists of is, first they do Japji Sahib, which is the prayer of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, and it is in the Sri Guru Granth Sahib. Now, this is good, that's okay. And then the next part is yoga, the Yogi Bhajan yoga. And they do about, I think it's 20 minutes of that. Now, most people come for that, from what I've seen and observed. Very few people come to the Japji Sahib, the Sikh prayer. Maybe 3 or 4 people, if you will. Most come for this yoga. And like I said, it's done in the Darbar Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, which is a violation of the Sikh Maryada. You're not supposed to be doing exercises and paying attention to other things besides the Sri Guru Granth Sahib in the Darbar of Sri Guru Granth Sahib. So that's a no-no as far as the Sikh Rahat Maryada and Sikh code of conduct. Now, then after they do the yoga, they do these mantras. I believe it's 6 different mantras that Yogi Bhajan made up, and they're done to different melodies. So one of the mantras is actually a Hindu mantra, this Vayanti mantra. And it was evidently, according to 3HO, passed from Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras, and he was a Hindu. And it has nothing to do with Sikhi. So that is chanted inside the Sikh Gurdwara, which is, again, another violation of the Sikh Maryada. And then the other mantras are a mishmash, using some Gurbani and then some made up mantras of Yogi Bhajans. So it's something that I think has got to go. Excuse me. I believe Yogi Bhajan made up these mantras in order to keep people in his cult. They're not based in any kind of lineage. I think that whole thing, even about the Patanjali thing, is nonsense, really. There's no record of that. I think Yogi Bhajan just kind of made that up. But you have to ask yourself, if you want to follow something by this guy, Yogi Bhajan, who is nothing more than a customs officer, and it's been shown now that he came here and sexually, physically abused people, financially abused them, and made up these mantras and yogas just to get power, money, and sex. So again, it's not based in any lineage or anything. And as this Tej Steiner described, it is really something that just gets you high and stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. So again, I think it's really got to go. One of these many things has got to go. Okay, so let's go back here to see more questions. So yeah, on that subject of the Aquarian Sadhna, I think that the Gurdwara there needs to be used for reciting Gurbani, and in the early Bhajan morning, this 4 a.m. period, this time is usually reserved for reciting Pat or reciting Gurbani, these 5 banis that Sikhs recite. So that's where that time should be used for that. And all of these Gurdwaras that 3HO runs has to have new leadership, so that the Gurdwaras are run according to the Sikh Maryada. Got another question here. Why do you say the mantras are made up? Mul mantra FEX is from Japji. I have been to several Gurdwaras in the UK to Simran where they also chant the Waheguru mantra. Okay, it is true that in the Aquarian Sadhna, they use the Mul mantra. All right, I'm to be corrected on that. That is correct. So of the 6 mantras in this Aquarian Sadhana, the Mul mantra is one that is okay, if you will, according to the is not a violation of the Sikh Maryada and is according to Gurbani. The other mantras are a mishmash, if you will, of Gurbani, where Yogi Bhajan would put together different shabads, if you will, and it's called kachabani, if you will, where they cut the bani. And this is a big no-no. Yogi Bhajan made up this Waheguru, Waheguru, Guru Ram Das Guru mantra. And there's no place in Gurbani where that is recorded like that. Of course, Waheguru is there, but not the way that Yogi Bhajan mishmashes them together. And I believe that that's incorrect and should not be done. And then, of course, there are many other mantras that Yogi Bhajan has made up. And when I say made up, some he's just made up without any, like this Vayanti mantra, this so-called Patanjali mantra. And then there's others that he's used parts of Gurbani and cut it and mishmashed it together. And so my question is, why follow that? Why not follow pure Gurbani? Okay. Okay, so now just going to look at some other pictures here. Now I want to point out here, well, first let's okay, I want to talk a little bit about how the people who are now speaking up against Yogi Bhajan, and many of them who are leaving, if you will, 3HO and leaving this or these organizations that Yogi Bhajan started, are cutting their hair, and they're also leaving the Sikh faith. So I've been reading posts on Pamela Dyson's our Facebook page and this Premka group. It occurs to me that Pamela is no longer a Sikh. That's pretty obvious. And she's posted things that are critical of organized religion. I, for one, think that organized religion is a good thing in many ways. And as you can see, I've remained a Sikh. Of the very few people who have left Yogi Bhajan group and remain Sikhs, I'm one of them. And so I don't know if Pamela is a Buddhist. She's given some examples of Buddhism or whatever, but she certainly seems like she's against organized religion. And this is a concern of mine and other Sikhs who are watching this whole situation unfold, where Yogi Bhajan's followers are cutting their hair. Some of them are cutting their hair, which are tenets of the Sikh faith, and taking off their dastars. You can see here where this person here calls themselves Khalsa. I didn't put their full name, but he says he's just throwing it all out. He's throwing out everything that had to do with Yogi Bhajan. And, it's disturbing. And it shows how Yogi Bhajan really damaged things and gave everybody these names like Singh, Kar, and Khalsa, and didn't really teach about the Sikh faith. This person says that they stopped wearing their turban, removed all symbols that could possibly relate back to the cult. And then he had I asked my wife to cut my hair, he says here. So I just want to put this out there for Sikhs and other people who are watching this video to think about this. Like I said, I'm very disturbed by it. And when down there in New Mexico, I would like to have more discussions about what's going on there and why people feel like they have to cut their hair and take off their dastars if they really feel like they don't have or they don't align with the Sikh faith anymore, and why that is, and things like that. So this is a post by Peter Blatchley. I knew him as Peter Singh back in the 80s. And he's talking about how you can still be a Sikh and not wear the star and not wear the bana. I just think that that's something that is not correct. You really do need to, if you're going to be calling yourself a Sikh or Singh or Kar or Khalsa, it requires following the Sikh Maryada and not cutting your hair and wearing a Sikh dastar. That's my feeling about it. That this is kind of a new age idea that you can do whatever you feel like. I don't have that opinion. I think Sikhi is a practice, a faith of rules, and you need to follow those rules. Most of us don't know what's good for us, and that's why we have a set of rules. We need to be disciplined about following a set of rules, and this, in my mind, brings us to a state of happiness, to a state of peace, not just following what feels good. And I've been criticized for this, because I know many people are against religion. It's a kind of a PC thing now to be against religion and kind of do whatever feels good. Just be one with nature or whatever. But I, for one, really believe that it's necessary to follow a rehet, or a code of conduct, and not always just do what feels good. And wearing the Sikh bana, if you will, the 5 Ks, as we call them, the 5 articles of faith, really represents a lifestyle. And whenever anybody sees me, or anybody who's a Sikh with a star, they know that this person will represent those principles, those values and ideas, and the moral character that comes with that. And if somebody isn't living to those moral characters and wearing those articles of faith, then shame on them. It should always be a reminder that if you're wearing these articles of faith, that you need to live to these high values, live to this code of conduct, if you will. I think that I've been saved many times by wearing a Sikh dastar and keeping my hair uncut. In my life, I can think back many times when I've really been saved from getting into debauchery by, having this Sikh dastar and these Sikh articles of faith as a reminder of who I am. Okay, so we got more questions here. Okay, so it says, I have a lot of Indian Punjabi friends and have been to deepest Punjab myself. Not all Sikh people are Amrit, but still are Sikh and go to the Gurdwara despite cutting their hair and not being in line with 5K. Would you not consider them Sikhs? Okay, quite simply, I don't consider them to be Sikhs. And they may say they are, but I don't. I think in order to be calling yourself a Sikh, you need to be following the wearing the 5Ks, and also to be living to the Sikh code of conduct, Sikh Rahat Maryada. That's a simple question. And as I've been saying before, I think that by wearing these articles of faith, it really gives a person a platform, if you will, in order to live to these high values, a reminder, if you will, when people see you, they're going to expect you to live to these high standards. That's the idea. And if you just let your hair down, go around in a ponytail, they just don't have the same respect. I witnessed this myself in India. Sikhs who wear a dastar or turban, they keep their hair uncut. They're really respected there. And I think that this is a really good set of values to take on. That's my belief. Okay, so I want to just look here if there's any other pictures I want to share here or any ideas. I think we should start wrapping this up. It's been going on now for an hour and a half, the webinar. And I hope you all have learned something from this. If you have any other questions, please bring them up now. And again, I'm hoping you're able to see it. There's a little hand, should be down there at the bottom of the screen, where there's a place you can click on and ask a question. So like a little hand looks like that, right down there at the bottom of the screen. And I can answer any verbal questions you might have. Well, I hope everybody's staying safe during this pandemic. My wife and I just got an opportunity to go up to the forest here where we live, and we just missed the highlights of the bluebells, little flowers, they're called bluebells. We missed them by a couple of weeks, but we couldn't leave the house for many weeks. We were on what's called lockdown here in the UK. So we did get up there the other day, just a couple of days ago, and were able to see those bluebells. Are really nice. Okay, so I think that's all for today. And thank you for attending. Again, I hope you all are staying safe and healthy. And please write me with any of your questions. I hope that you'll be able to join us next week. I'll be doing this, like I said, on a weekly basis. I like to share new information. And like I said, we've gotten this new letter from the SSSC board I wanted to discuss. And if some of you haven't heard what I talked about, if you came late to the webinar, I'll put a YouTube video up with the whole webinar on there. And you should be able to see what I talked about in the earlier part of the webinar. So hope to see you next week, and thank you very much for your time. YB Khalsa, YB Fateh.